Elder Theologos, An Extraordinary Life, based on a talk by His Eminence Metropolitan Clement of Larissa and Platamon. During the 1990s, the Elder Theologos would attend services at our Church of the Annunciation in Kolonos. Those of you who were parishioners there at that time will remember him. He was an old man who had lost his sight. The nun Kseni took care of him then and led him by the hand. This was, of course, the future abbess Mother Kseni, who today is the abbess of the Holy Dormition of the Theotokos convent in Thraco-Macedonis of Attica, where the holy relics of Saint Chrysostom, formerly of Florina, are kept. So, this Elder Theologos had an amazing story which had been printed into a booklet at one time, but since have likely all sold out. We received a blessing to republish a booklet on his life, which will be brief and interesting, but also extremely beneficial. I will say a few words now about the Elder Theologos. Although his heritage was from Crete, the Elder Theologos was born and raised in the Kolonos region in Athens. He was born sometime in 1913 or 1914 to pious parents. His family was very large. His parents had 17 children, and he was the youngest, the 17th. In holy baptism, they gave him the name Nicholas, and even from a young age he was hard-working and very devoted to prayer. The light of God burned brightly in Nicholas's soul. When the calendar change occurred in Greece in 1924, he was already about 10 years old. He remained, together with his parents and siblings, who were much older than him, of course. The whole family remained in the patristic old calendar, as did many other people who did not follow this innovation. Why did they not follow? Because of their orthodox intuition. Did anyone instruct them on the proper course? In their early years, those who kept the old calendar did not have shepherds. In the beginning, there were no systems of organized hierarchs and priests that remained. Later, little by little, the priestly structure was solidified amid persecutions. The people kept the traditional calendar on their own. Who taught the people to do that? God did, who spoke to their souls, to those who were pure of heart. Nicholas, therefore, remained since early childhood in the old calendar, diligently observing all the teachings of the Church, attending the services, praying, keeping the fasts. Since boyhood, he also worked at a certain factory. Back then, especially in such a large family, children had to help make ends meet. They placed him in a position at this factory, and his older co-workers consistently noticed that Nicholas would keep all the fasts with the old calendar, not with the new. One day, the manager's brother, who was the theology professor, came to visit his brother at the factory, and the manager said to him, "We have a kid here who is with the old," he says. "Who knows what that is, old-new?" "Well," the theologian responded, "let this young man come here so that we can enlighten the poor thing a bit, so that he will not remain backwards." So they summoned Nicholas, telling him that the brother of the manager, the theologian, wants to give him a lesson. Young Nicholas made the sign of the cross and calmly presented himself before them. He greeted them, and they were seated in the manager's office to begin their discussion. At one point, Nicholas noticed that, while it was a fast day, either Wednesday or a Friday, there was a plate of savory non-fasting snacks in front of the professor, of which he partook. At once Nicholas said, "Forgive me, Professor, but if you invited me here to enlighten me when you, today, partake of non-fasting items, then there is no need to tell me anything, thank you. Keep your theology for yourself, sir. I do not need it." The professor became irate, of course, and as usual began to ridicule tradition, saying, "You all care about the letter of the law, but we go to the substance." But without taking the beginning steps, is it possible to advance to the later ones? Without respecting the way, can you arrive at substance? It is not possible to approach substance while ignoring the laws of the Church. Thus Nicholas exposed his shame, and he departed humiliated, because he was proven a transgressor of the most basic commands of God. The authorities waged a persecution against the old calendar struggle of confession that was especially fierce, and from the beginning, Nicholas stood against their attempt to exterminate the true Church in Greece. Especially near the end of the 1920s and into the 1930s, the confessors of the faith were most severely persecuted by the state church. Nicholas was always on the forefront of the struggle, in rallies, protests, etc. This does not mean that our people sought to create unrest. It was only when the authorities arrested our priests and defrocked them, or when unjust courtroom trials took place against us. Then they would go to protest. Nicholas was one of the leaders of the struggle, and he was frequently beaten by the authorities. Imagine, back then, before the war, the police had great power. They carried clubs and gave severe beatings. When the authorities received a command from their superiors, "Go dismantle the fanatics," they went indeed and would leave nothing standing, destroying everything in their wake. Now, to beat criminals is one thing, but to beat innocent Orthodox Christians? Completely inhuman. These persecutions that we lived day to day back then. Nicholas received such severe beatings since childhood during these persecutions that even he wondered how he survived, and he would say, "I should have departed as a martyr, but it seems that God had a plan for me, and he kept me." Once, before the feast of the entry of the Theotokos with the Old Calendar in 1935, the policemen had beaten Nicholas with their clubs to the point where he was black and blue. Every inch of his body was bruised. By the time he returned home, he was swollen everywhere. That same night, there was a vigil at the monastery of the Theotokos, and Nicholas insisted that he would attend it, even with his injuries. "But is this how we will take you to the vigil, in a stretcher?" his family protested, but Nicholas insisted. "Yes, even in a stretcher. I will go to the vigil, and I will beseech the All-Holy Lady to heal me, since I was beaten for the glory of her Son." Even though his family was faithful, even they did not believe him, and they laughed at him. But lo, by morning his health was completely restored, and his color was back. The bruises and swellings had completely disappeared. He returned home from church with a proud and glorious stride, and said to his brothers, "Touch me, examine me. Do you remember how I was last night? Well, look how I am now." You see what great miracles God shows to all those who have strong zeal. We do not have as much faith, and therefore we do not see such miracles. Although Nicholas was inclined toward monasticism, his parents, in those days the parents decided these things, found for him a good girl from Menide of Acharne in Attica named Constantina. After he met her, Nicholas said to her, "I had other thoughts, as I considered myself given over to God and wanted to dedicate myself to him. However, we shall proceed to marriage, since my parents arranged things this way, but I have my terms. First and foremost, my family and I follow the so-called Old Calendar. You also, from today, are with the Old, if you wish. If you do not wish, let us clarify now, as to avoid any more needless steps." And then Nicholas continued describing the following. "We will live a Christian life, focused on the spiritual, attending church on all Sundays and feast days, keeping all the fasts, and we will generally live a modest life, nice and Christian. Do you want to proceed?" With all this, the young lady was taken aback. The world had not gone downhill yet to the degree that is happening today. We're talking about 1940. However, these conditions seemed a little extreme to the girl. Old calendar, constant church services. What does he intend to do, make me a nun? Constantina thought. "I will think about it," she replied. Constantina was a well-intentioned young lady, so God deigned to show her a sign. What sign? Today we heard in the Gospel that Christ went and brought light to those sitting in the region and shadow of death. Here is what God showed Constantina to establish her. That night, as she considered what answer to give, she saw in her sleep that she and her family, together with her close relatives, were in a dark place, wherein they could barely see one another, as it was dim and everything was blurry. A little higher, however, she could see an upper level, as though that house had an invisible ceiling, and in that upper level she saw Nicholas with his family and other acquaintances, basking in abundant light and joy and blessedness. Then she heard a voice saying to her, "If you want to be there also, where Nicholas is, then accept all that he describes to you. If you accept, then you will find yourself there with him. Otherwise, you will remain here where you are. Choose." The dream was so vivid that Constantina awoke, jumped out of bed, and immediately did her cross, saying with determination, "I'm going to find Nicholas." When she met him, she said to him, "I accept, because I also want to come into the light, and not remain with those in darkness." See what wonders the Lord reveals. In those days God showed many signs and miraculous events, which we know from the elders. He revealed to us that whosoever remained in the old calendar walked in the light of God, irrespective of the possible mistakes or passions with which they may have struggled as humans. Nevertheless, they kept their confession. Now we will not say that the others who conformed themselves to the papal calendar innovation instantly passed into the dark depths of hell, but that they walked in a spiritually dim place, and it was getting darker. And this was 1940. Since then, the horizon has been continuously darkening. As for Constantina, she developed such a zeal for the faith that she not only embraced all the terms that Nicholas suggested, but she surpassed them. She was the first to urge Nicholas on to the fulfillment of their spiritual obligations, their daily prayers and prostrations. And indeed, they lived a married life in modesty and Christian piety. Now, Nicholas and Constantina desired to have a child, but in a trial permitted by God, after more than 10 years of marriage, they were still not able to become parents. This was Constantina's sorrow, over which she prayed incessantly. What else could she have done? Direct her attention to doctors for procedures such as in vitro fertilization? But these are not blessed things. We would be forcing nature. If God wills, He gives. If He does not will, for reasons that He knows, then He does not give. We will not seek to transgress nature and force God. So, one time, when she was fervently praying to St. Anna, the mother of the Theotokos, who is the protectress of childless couples, Constantina fell asleep, and it appeared to her that she was in the chapel of St. Minos, which stands outside of the convent of Panagia in Thracomacedonis. A nun named Anna then appeared and said to her, "Constantina, your prayer has been heard. You will have a child, which shall be a girl. You will name her Evangelia." Constantina rejoiced at this news, but objected to the name. "I await the child joyously, and I am thankful, but I do not want to name her Evangelia. I do not care for that name. I want to name her Ekaterini, which is the name of my mother-in-law." Then St. Anna replied thus, revealing her identity. "As we said, you will have a baby girl, and she will be named Evangelia because she must take the name of my daughter, Evangelisu Gikaran Megali, or Good Tidings to Earth of Great Joy." After that, however, St. Anna added something strange. "You will not enjoy her for long," then disappeared. Constantina woke up with great joy on the one hand because her supplication had been heard, but sorrow on the other hand that she would not enjoy her for long. After some time, in the year 1951, Constantina realized that she was indeed pregnant. Unfortunately, that year, 1951, was when we lived through the great persecution of the Old-Calendarists. It started early in the year, in January, right after our people celebrated Theophany of 51. A fierce, unbelievable persecution broke out. Perhaps some of you remember it as young folks then. A terrible persecution. They locked up our churches everywhere, arrested the priests, shaved them by force, beat them. What went on is indescribable, but it had to be so, that we might pass through fire and iron. During this time of persecution, our lay people would organize rallies in Metropolis Square at the Archdiocese in order to peacefully protest to end the horrific persecutions and to allow spiritual freedom. Even the heretics had their freedom. Should we be the only ones without freedom? The beatings endured by those who protested there at that time cannot be described. The most tragic reality was that the authorities respected nothing, not even Nicholas with his pregnant wife. Even during her long-awaited pregnancy, Constantina's love for the church was so strong that she would not give up. She was in the front lines of the rally. Extraordinary. A policeman attacked them with his club, and he struck Nicholas, who collapsed, bleeding. Then he attacked Constantina, who was advanced in her pregnancy, without respecting her condition, and kicked her with such force that she was left unconscious. Everyone who witnessed this believed that the unborn infant surely must have been destroyed. The beating sent Constantina into labor and accelerated the birth of the child. By the time they transported the injured Constantina to the hospital, the baby had been born. God so ordained, and the infant girl survived. However, the kick that the pregnant mother had received during the barbaric attack was so powerful that the baby was born with visible injuries on her head. Her parents, however, did not lament over these marks. To the contrary, they boasted that their child, baby Evangelia, bore the marks of confession, even from infanthood. In fact, Father Parthenius, the elder who ministered to the aforementioned holy convent of Panagia Thracomacedonan at that time, would say to her, whenever she visited as a small child, "Welcome to the little confessor." When little Evangelia grew up, she became a nun, taking the name Kseni in tonsure. This is, of course, the current abbess, Mother Kseni, of the convent of the Theotokos of Thraco-Macedonat, where the relics of St. Chrysostomos, the new confessor, are located, as we mentioned earlier. Before she became abbess, Mother Kseni took care of the blind elder Theologos, who was her father in the flesh, who had been Nicholas in the world. The circumstances under which little Evangelia grew up during the persecutions and what her family went through is another whole story. How did they accomplish her baptism? We did not have access to our churches. They had sealed them off. Do you know where baptisms took place then? After midnight, in the dark, in basements. The priests would go there disguised because they could not go out with beards or rasa. And they would celebrate baptisms with the fear that the baby would cry and that they would be discovered by the authorities. Evangelia's baptism alone, which took place in 1952 in a basement in Piraeus, is another whole story in and of itself. What the family endured when the child was a baby, I cannot begin to tell. Where people found themselves during the years of persecution to celebrate the Nativity, Theophany, or Pascha, unbelievable stories. But let us move on so that we might not delay, even though this is our extraordinary history and our background, which is our duty to know and appreciate accordingly. I do not narrate these events today for any other reason except that we appreciate what we are carrying. Who suffered, and what did they suffer to deliver the pearl of great price to us? We found everything ready, and we say, nice, aren't we doing nicely here in our church? Truly, but in order for you to be here today, and for me to be here today, some had to spill their blood. No one would be here today in the church if the sacrifices of others had not proceeded. Our predecessors stood up and confessed, and they suffered. We must respect this, so that we are also prepared to struggle and be proven worthy of the treasures that they bequeathed to us with their blood. In another incident, during the persecution of 1953, they were attacked by the police as they brought out the epitaphios in Piraeus for a procession on Holy Friday. It was forbidden for us to carry the epitaphios in a procession. We were not supposed to exist. Nicholas, as a brave and courageous man, physically intervened and scuffled with the policemen in defense of the body of Christ on the epitaphios. The police attempted to grab the body from the epitaphios, but Nicholas also rushed to take it. The flowers on the epitaphios were destroyed in the violent disturbance, but Nicholas held on to the body, tugging it away from the policemen. Then another young man came to assist Nicholas, and together they were able to pull the body away from the hands of the police. The two young men began to run so they could save it, but right behind them the two enraged policemen chased after them. They ran for some time when one of the policemen slipped in the mud, and thus they escaped from his clutches. Further down, the two young men made a sudden turn down a dark alley, and the second policeman became confused at the dead end, and they escaped from him too. As soon as the two young men realized that they had escaped from the police, their excitement was so great that, finally stopping at some abandoned construction site, they carefully placed the body down on a clean spot and literally began to leap for joy that they had rescued Christ's body from the policemen. Suddenly, as they celebrated this blessed victory, Nicholas realized that the other young man began to change in his appearance, becoming radiant, and started slowly ascending to the sky. Nicholas stared at him in shock, not believing his own eyes. It was an angel of the Lord who, as he ascended, looked back at the puzzled Nicholas, smiling. Such extraordinary signs Christ revealed. Imagine, what a blessing. Our elders lived these things. These are not fairy tales. Nicholas was a serious man and dignified. He did not lie, nor was he the dreamy type. He was a deeply spiritual person since childhood, fearless, courageous, with zeal. This is why God showed such people such miracles, to establish them in times of horrific persecutions. God wants zeal, not fanaticism, not screaming and extreme behaviors, but inward zeal, strong faith, and stability. When their daughter, Evangelia, was about 2 years old, Constantina became very sick, unto death. She fervently prayed to St. Irene Chrysovolantou, another very miraculous saint, who appeared to her and provided a small extension of time for her, because the child was so young. The saint told Constantina that once the child grows a bit more, God will take Constantina to be with him. St. Irene did not specify how many more years God would give her, but as it turned out, she lived about an additional 6 years beyond that point. When Evangelia was about 7 to 8 years old, about the year 1960, Constantina fell asleep. Her end was so blessed and peaceful. God even allowed her to see angels before she fell asleep, who had come to take her. The ailing Constantina suddenly exclaimed, "The house filled with bright young men dressed in white. Give them treats," she exhorted those around her, who of course could not see them. About a decade after the repose of his wife, and having finished raising Evangelia, Nicholas felt that the time was drawing nigh for him to fulfill his youthful promise and desire, and become a monk. Prior to his tonsure, however, Nicholas became a pilgrim and visited the Holy Land. What signs God showed him there! He entered the Holy Sepulchre to worship, but while in there, it appeared to him that there was no roof. Suddenly, he was basking in the light of God. He did not know where he was, nor for how long. When God withdrew the light, then he saw the roof of the Holy Sepulchre again, and everything as it had been. Nicholas asked those around him in the Holy Sepulchre if they had perceived anything out of the ordinary, but no one had. It seems the vision was just for him. The following year, having entered the 1970s, Nicholas desired to go on a pilgrimage to the island of Patmos. During that trip, Nicholas suffered a heart attack. He asked St. John the Theologian, who is the protector of heart disease sufferers, since St. John reclined on the Lord's chest at the Last Supper, to deem him worthy to complete the pilgrimage, and after that to become a monk. And indeed, the evangelist appeared to him and told him to go venerate without fear. "And what name shall I receive at my tonsure, my saint?" Nicholas asked St. John. "I will name you," the theologian told him, "Theologos." Nicholas rejoiced at this news and began to exclaim like a child, "Thank you, my saint, you are my joy." Finally, in 1973, the tonsure of Nicholas, now monk, Father Theologos, took place. That night, during the tonsure, his wife, Constantina, who had fallen asleep many years earlier, appeared to a certain nun at a skete in Iliopolis, who had been a family acquaintance. Constantina appeared full of joy, and wore a glorious crown on her head. She said, "What Nicholas does today on earth brings me immense joy and happiness." The nun who witnessed this did not know that somewhere else that same night, the monastic tonsure of Father Theologos was taking place. So she wondered what Nicholas could be doing to cause Constantina to appear in so much honor and glory. So the nun marked the date of the mysterious appearance on her calendar. After a certain amount of time, the two monastics ran into each other, and the riddle was solved, and they both understood what event had given Constantina so much joy. Do you see how God honors those who honor him? With the passage of time, the elder Theologos lost his sight. However, he remained peaceful, unwavering in his prayer, his fasting, and his spiritual life, always calm and meek. So I have told you briefly about the life of Father Theologos and his family, people who were our contemporaries, whom we met, and whom we got to know well. People such as these have been among us, and we refer to them today, if for no other reason, so that we can be empowered by their example and try a little harder to present ourselves as worthy of their labors and their confession. This is the glorious path, the pure path, the sanctified path, the lofty path. I pray that God deems us worthy until the end to remain on this path. And if we do not have much to present to God in terms of good works, at least let us keep the faith, and then we can say to him, "I have nothing to show you, O my God, but in a world with so much turbulence, so much confusion, so many slanders, so many lies and evil, I kept the holy faith." This will be huge, and God will have mercy, and he will overlook mistakes and weaknesses. The days that are coming are likely to be more difficult, and for this reason, our strength must become palpable. This is why we are saying these things, to prepare. Where does the good soldier distinguish himself? In battle. If in times of peace, before the battle, the soldier has not prepared, has not exercised, how will he perform during the battle? If you are sluggish, you will not have the blessing, and you will not have the power of confession from God, because confession is a gift from God to those who prepare. At the same time, if some are not strong and capable confessors, God will still cover them, as long as they have blessed intent and they do not betray the faith, they do not retreat, do not bow down, and do not become discouraged.